Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom Podcast. I've got Zachary Cote here, and he is the Executive Director of Thinking Nation. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Stewart.
So how do we build a thinking nation?
Well, in conversations with you, I think a lot of it comes down to how do we cultivate citizens that can ask good questions? And I think our approach is let's rethink public education, and in our lane, it is history education, in a way that develops thinkers rather than kind of walking encyclopedias built for memory.
And I love memory. I've been reading this crazy book by Frances Yates, who is a scholar of the occult and mysticism, from history perspective. And she wrote this mind-blowing book about how science was started because in the early modern period they found scriptures from Neoplatonic magic from the second century AD, and that sort of informed science. And how did I get here? This idea of oh man, I totally lost my train of thought. Questions and history and memory. So memory. Have you ever heard of the memory palace? Have you ever heard of that term before?
I have heard it. Yeah.
Yeah. So the memory palace is from these guys.
Okay.
So it's from Neoplatonic second century magic, apparently, but it invokes this imagination, and there are two ways to memorize as we're currently in it. I use rote memorization. I use it more. I haven't actually used memory palaces that much because they're quite intense.
Yeah.
Given the fact that they come from the second century Neoplatonic magic. But it's such memory is good, but I definitely agree with you that we don't want walking encyclopedias, which seems to be the current educational framework. And you probably have a much better understanding of what current education does, right?
Yeah, I would say that in theory it's not, and in practice it is. I think, so one thing I kind of define history as is that history is a discipline. The past is the content in which we practice that discipline. So a way to put it in the terms of memory is, the point is to think, but if you have nothing to think about, you can't think. So memory is necessary, but it's a means to an end for deeper critical thinking.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Content. So history, and history is the memory of our civilization, right? What is history?
It's the study of the memory of our civilization. Yeah. So history is the study of the past, and the past, we have to clarify, it's the past as it's remembered, because I don't even remember everything I did yesterday. What do I remember? What do we collectively remember as a society? What do particular people groups remember compared to other people groups, which there are many differences, and that, we can talk about historiography, which is, the study of historical writing and how different people interpret the past differently. And so because memory is so complex, it's often individualized because we remember different things. If we focus on memory as the primary aim of a history education, we're never going to agree and we're never going to win. There's too much variation. And so even the idea of a collective, national past, to me is a little bit dangerous, because I focus on different things. I am, a product of my own environment, and as different students and different peers are products of their environments. And but if we have a particular methodology or epistemology that we follow after, that actually can be very unifying, even if the content in which we apply those things to is different.
Okay, interesting. So memory is very complex. Narratives, groups have different narratives, and we have this discipline where we can essentially collectively remember different things that happened, and it all is from a different point of view, because both as individuals and as groups we have essentially different points of view. Reminds me of decentralization and sort of, from my understanding, where we're headed in history, or how do we even know where we're headed in the future, is that I see the TV is no longer as big of a product in terms of our cultural influence. So when we had a TV, it's like basically a TV is broadcasting what people should pay attention to. Mm-hmm. And now we're sort of fragmenting. It feels like a lot of us are fragmenting into our different groups. And do you agree with that? Do you disagree with it? And feel free to disagree with me. Yeah.
No, I think we curate our own lives now, right? TV basically essentially allowed for large companies to curate what we do and how we interact with it. And, I was kind of looking at my Instagram feed recently and reminding myself, like, I curate a very particular narrative of my own personal life on this feed. But I also curate the movies that I watch now. I curate the shows that I watch. I don't rely on when things are being published. Even my own children, who my own children don't have tablets or like any personal electronic devices, but we do have a TV in the house. And if they say, "Hey, can we watch this?" It's almost 100% sure that we can, because I can choose anything now. I don't have to rely on like this plays at 8:30 a.m. and it's only 8 a.m. So no. And so even with the TV, there's still this sense of curation.
That's really interesting, and I imagine that's reflecting in kids. And you have a lot of experience because you not only are running Thinking Nation, but you've also have an experience as a teacher in the past. Is that right?
Yeah. So I was a middle school social studies teacher prior to Thinking Nation.
And so is this, like, how does this all change our approach to learning about history? The fact that we're all sort of decentralizing into our own reality tunnels and going into and curating those reality tunnels. Like, how is that affecting kids and education?
I mean, I think the existence of the term alternative facts, I think can summarize that pretty well. That the concept of an alternative fact just seemed so kind of absurd, but in the last 8 years or so, it's kind of taken for granted that it's the norm. And so I think that's where we really actually need to kind of double down on this disciplinary approach to history, because I can't control what facts students engage with. And I don't even remember some of the facts, that I engaged with as an undergrad or a graduate student. But I've internalized a particular methodology. I've internalized a particular epistemology, a way of knowing that can now be applied regardless of the facts that I encounter. And so to me, it's like, if we're going to curate everything, then we probably want to curate it in an ethical and, a way that enhances human flourishing rather than detracts from it.
Nice. So then what I'm getting from you is essentially methodology and epistemology. That's where we need to focus on. So what is a good methodology or epistemology? How can we understand what is true from what is false? I mean, it's a giant question that a lot of people have been trying to wrap their head around for a long time. But what do you think?
I think in some cases, the what is true versus what is false is an appropriate response. Also, I think in most interactions of humanity, it's really a continuum of correctness. I think there is such thing as capital T truth or absolute truth. I also think it's a lot more narrow than we let it be. We want everything to be a capital T truth. Like, my side is right, your side is wrong. And that binary thinking really hurts, like, at least in the United States, this idea of e pluribus unum, out of many one. We can't acknowledge the out of many if we're just constantly saying, like, and rather living in a pluralistic society, we're living in a binary society. So one of the ways of knowing, the methodologies, is to ask good questions that almost every historian I talk to, they, like, at some point in the conversation, they'll acknowledge that they make things more complicated, right? I've complicated.
Historians make things more complicated.
Yeah, so like we can't say that this was the reason, X was the reason for Y, but X was a reason for Y, and so if we apply that type of thinking, this nuance, right, that everything has a little bit of nuance and complexity, we apply that to the past, but we also apply it to our relationships with our neighbors. If I'm thinking of like a civic society, then rather than asking them questions to prove that we're right and we're wrong, or that this fact is true and this fact is false, we're saying, oh, I actually understand why you came to believe this, even if I disagree with you. And so I think the beauty of the discipline of history is that it allows for the gray. It allows for nuance. It doesn't mandate that everything fits into a very particular framework. Like, a sociologist doesn't, and I'm going to be a little bit critical, so apologies to sociologists, but like a sociologist can't, it has nothing to do, if magic was the reason something happened, a sociologist can't use that, right? Because it doesn't fit within a sociological framework, an academic framework.
Oh, interesting.
Whereas a historian can say, the evidence says that the people that were engaging here believe that it was magic. I personally may not think that was the case, but that's where the evidence is. So that's the story I'm going to write. And so we're not confined to a particular framework, which allows for nuance, that allows for the gray. And I think that's really healthy for society.
It goes right back to Francis Yates, because I'm reading this book about magic, and there's all these things that I have no interest in about the particulars of magic in the 15th century and the 16th century and all the strange things that lead up to memory palaces. But I'm so interested in the fact that science came from this. I had to ask the question, like, is this woman a magic occultist? And she actually said something in a way that made me think that she was, like, that it was her own practice, but I had to go check LLMs and ask it, like, was she, and it turns out she's just a historian. So she's just studying this from this perspective of, like, this happened, this is what people believed, and it's so interesting. And it's also why I like history, because every time I read history, it's just like, and I grew up, one of my best friends is a professor at a college, a university in New York, and he was an assistant professor at Stanford, was like, just like, as soon as he came out the womb, he was going to Stanford, and like all, like the whole thing, and studying Italian Renaissance fortifications. And we always used to, go on these long walks and talk about history. And the thing I gathered from him is that essentially, every time you look at it, you find something new. And most of the time, you're probably not right. If you have an understanding of what's going on in history, usually that's probably not accurate, because there's so many things, and the primary documents are so varied, and it all goes back to people in the past having a perspective that differed from other people's perspective, and different people remembering different things, which is just why it's so interesting as well. And also, the thing I don't understand about our current culture is, why is history not really valued that much? Like, it's really hard to have history conversations with a lot of people. It doesn't feel like it's part of our current values, is it?
Not in the way I define it. I think history, I was reading a historian, so, we just celebrated Juneteenth here, and I was reading a historian on Juneteenth, and she talked about, she grew up as a black woman in Texas, and she was told when her community celebrated Juneteenth, the white community, said, like, why are you holding on to the past, right? And then her quick response is, she's like, there's nowhere in the country where the phrase "remember the Alamo" is not used more than here. So you just as equally want to remember the past and dwell on the past. You just don't want to dwell on this past. And so I think we live history every day as a society. The historian David Hackett Fisher, he wrote a book in 1970 called Historians' Fallacies. And he says in the conclusion, not everyone thinks historically all the time, but everyone thinks historically some of the time. And I think that's like a good way. Like, we're all doing this thinking when it's convenient, but are we doing it as like an epistemology, right? And I think history is now used as fuel for culture wars. And so we love using history when history elevates our present claim. So it's a usable past. But the job of the historian is to understand, not to cast judgment. And that doesn't mean historians can't cast judgment. I don't think that that's, we're allowed to make statements of like moral claims, but the chief aim of the historian is to understand. And I'd say that approach to history is not very common, but we love using the past when it's convenient for our present, for sure.
Yeah, and it's true. It's like, I think I would correct my statement to that. It's harder to have an in-depth historical conversation, but we all learn history. Like we all have a compulsory education system, so that everyone does have a historical understanding as long as they're literate, and most people are literate, right? Is that right? Like yeah?
Yeah.
What do you think
and I one thing I learned this phrase from a Protestant pastor in New York, and he was talking about Christianity, but he is essentially saying we need to rethink how we act as Christians, and we need to create a radical minimum standard for discipleship. And I think right now history education has a minimum standard. Let's remember certain areas of the past. And what I'm saying is let's try to create a radical minimum standard for history education, which is centering this type of thinking rather than remembering a particular knowledge.
Yeah, interesting. And I'm so disconnected from education, mostly because it was such a painful experience growing up, and it was like I went to both public schools and private schools, and I've seen my niece and my nephew go through San Francisco education, public education, and so I'm like I have a little bit of understanding, but I'm so disconnected. I don't have kids. I'm now in Argentina, where it's seems like a very different education system that I also don't have access to because I'm not Argentine, so I can't like think on the nuance there, and it just seems like there's so much there in terms like in civics. And what is your historical take on how education was created in the United States, where it is now, and where it's headed?
I don't know if I have. I think as a historian, maybe I'll say I speak to things I'm an expert in, and I try not to speak to things I'm not. So I don't know if I can say like I don't know if I have a judgment on that, the history of education. I think some things I notice about education now is that the student bodies have become incredibly complex. I think that the role of a teacher has become incredibly complex, and then there's a lot of oversight and standardization. And what we've done is we've created an education system. So maybe this is a little bit of a moral claim, but like we've created an educational system that is conveniently assessed. So if it's not right, so if it's not conveniently assessed, then we're actually not asking teachers to do it because we can't create data around it. And Americans are obsessed with data.
We are.
And so what that does is it really puts education in a very particular box. I think this is going to be one of the few benefits of AI is that we can assess things that are deeper than what's traditionally been assessed. And so if we still only pursue the most convenient assessments to dictate what we teach, we're actually going to be able to assess deeper things that can dictate that we teach things like epistemology and deep methods of a particular discipline, because we can assess student thinking through large language models on really complex things.
Yeah, interesting. Oh, I got to ask, I mean, so it's like, the question I'm about to ask goes more into business because that's what I have more familiarity with, using AI to apply to business. I'm noticing that a lot of companies are starting to stop the usage of AI, but then I know from speaking with people who are at these businesses, they're just using AI on a different screen. And one of the most potent uses of AI is within education. I'm using it all the time to educate myself.
Yeah.
So I just going to extend that to children and imagine that they're probably doing the same thing, right? That probably the education system hasn't, caught up to the fact that they are doing this. Is that accurate? Like, what's going on in terms of AI in education?
Yeah, I think we need to say it really loud from the mountaintop that AI is a tool and not a crutch, because I think a lot of students are using it as a crutch. You know, you and you have a podcast on questions. And so like you are trained in asking good questions. So I feel like you using AI to learn is basically a more structured Wikipedia, which is really helpful. But a student, right, a 10th grader using AI, they are not trained in asking good questions. And so they're going to see something that AI produces that is better than what they could produce, and they're going to take it as gospel. And that's really problematic, right? You and I, like you said that you kept trying to ask questions around Francis Yates. Like, the easier answer that a lot of people would do is that they would just accept the first response and move on. And that's really problematic. So my worry is I don't think AI should be in the hands of students. I think you and I can use AI in a productive and effective way, and we have years of education and training behind us that support our use of this tool, right? I worked construction for my dad growing up, and he handed me a shovel, not the backhoe. He did not put me on a tractor, right? And that's okay. So why are we handing kids the keys to the tractor? Like, that just seems so silly to me.
But like, they're going to use it. There's no way around it, right? Because like, your children don't have the tablets and everything like that, but all the other kids all have all the other devices. You know, and there's no way around that one. I definitely agree with you that this is like, it's like handing keys to the tractor, napalm, like all these
hard drugs.
Hard drugs. It's like and it's already happening with adults, like, who are now getting themselves into autodidactic spirals of believing that whatever comes out of the ChatGPT is reality. Whereas, like, I've been working in this field, and I know that these things are trained. They're probabilistic, so they give you answers based on the prompt in these really complex ways. But it's essentially just pulling things out of a hat. And they're less and less hallucinating, so they can give more factual answers, but it depends on the way you ask it. And so it's becoming a sort of religion. Like, people are creating religions where they're believing that they've awakened consciousness within ChatGPT, and that's adults. Like, that's not even the kids. Although maybe the kids will have a better immune system. Do you see any signs that they're developing immune system?
Not right now. I think that's, I feel like there's a generation, I'm a millennial. There's, I think the younger millennials are recognizing that maybe the way we've approached social media wasn't the most healthy, and we're tailoring it back. But that wasn't us in college. Like, we were diehards. We were using it every second we could. And I think students, unfortunately, are in that phase with AI.
And it's interesting because I have I have a AI club down here in Buenos Aires where we're teaching people how to vibe code and do all these things with programming and stuff. And so I have a new intern, and they're from a top school in the U.S. and it's really interesting. It's the first time I've sort of worked with Zoomer, as they're calling them, Generation Z, and it's really interesting because extremely bright. But in this phase of just all these tools, so many different tools, and it's really interesting seeing that question asking, because the question asking, I don't think I got it until about 10 years ago that questions are really important. And I come from a line of journalists, so it's like probably in my blood to ask a lot of different questions. But it's so interesting because the automatic, when you're young particularly, is to just believe whatever's written or believe whatever someone tells you if you view them as an authority. Is that accurate? What do you think?
Yeah, there was a book. Maybe you remember the author. I don't remember, but it was written a number of years ago called "The Death of Expertise," and I think that's actually the problem, is that we're actually much more willing to concede authority to ChatGPT than we are to fellow human beings.
Yeah.
We know more than the doctor or the historian or whatever it may be, the environmental biologist, because we Googled it, and now we can ChatGPT it, so it's even more refined. And so I think our relationship to authority needs to change quite a bit. I think this is maybe where I come off most traditional or conservative. I think that there needs to be like a re-establishment of a trust in institutions, which the institutions have failed us. I don't want to sugarcoat that. But I do think that a society can't operate without those structures, without those unmovable authority figures. I think are really important. I was reading G.K. Chesterton, who's a British Catholic philosopher at the turn of the 20th century. And he asked this question in his book, Orthodoxy, and he says, what is tradition if not democracy extended to the dead? Whoa. And I love that he put tradition and democracy into the same sentence, because so often the proponents of democracy are down with the past, out with the old, in with the new, let the people speak. But real democracy is all voices, even if they're no longer with us. And I think that's really a powerful way to understand institutions and authority.
So how do you build institutions? Because you are building one right now. You've got Thinking Nation.
Sure.
That is an institution, right? But also I'll try to do a quick rundown of my understanding of history, which is in the 1500s we built science, and it came out of the church. Copernicus had to talk to the people in the church. And they had to do this process, and this strange process of back and forth, where church was like, okay, we like that stuff, we don't like that stuff. Let's get rid of that. You're a heretic. Let's burn that guy. And all that stuff happened. And then you had the Reformation, and all of a sudden the Protestants did something that was totally against what the Catholic Church wanted, and that created this space for Neoplatonic magic to come in, and it was almost like a bridge. A lot of the people who became really interested in this Neoplatonic stuff were people trying to bridge this gap between the Protestants and the Catholics, which by the 1600s was really violent. So science started out with this questioning, and then it ended up sort of questioning everything about civilization, everything about Western civilization. It in my view, eroded a lot of those institutions that we've been discussing, and it feels like we're now on the outside of that. It feels like we're like most of our institutions, as you discussed, it's they're not believed in anymore. And how do we rebuild after that? Can we rebuild? What's going on there?
Well, I think that a lot of these institutions, that's true. I think a Western civilization, I think there's some nuance for sure that can be unraveled, but I think that's a fair summary of some things. But I think if we're focusing on the United States, I think that we had some strong institutions. I think the 1950, basically post World War II for historians, that era of historiography is called the consensus era. And so in this, and then Vietnam screwed all that up. Rightfully so, right? How can we trust a government that does this stuff? But there was a season that I can speak to, at least in the last 100 years, where there was this trust in institutions, that because someone was politically different from you didn't mean that they were your enemy. And so we have to, we kind of have to, I think there was a piece of a shared past that allowed for that. And I think that's probably a little naive. I think that we are in a much more diverse country right now, right? My friends have different ethnic backgrounds, racial backgrounds, religious backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, so we're less homogenized than we have been, which is why our institution, if Thinking Nation is considered an institution, I think is built around collaboration, right? So like working with others and not assuming that we are the only thing. Being honest, I think that like I, in both education and business, I'm always pretty disheartened by the lack of honesty among people, that everyone's trying to get ahead and we're willing to bend rules when it's convenient. And it's kind of wild to me that my framework of, if I told you I will do it, I will do it, is actually a little bit of an anomaly. But I think that these are ways that I hope to build an institution, is honesty and trust and a collaborative spirit, a willingness to work together, a willingness not to be the smartest person in the room, but to ask good questions. So it goes back to, I mean, this is why I love what I do. Like, it goes back to this discipline, this way of knowing. I think it's the methods in which we pursue success in anything are more important than the success itself. And that's what's going to hopefully invigorate faith in institutions, if those institutions are willing to do that. And I do fear that they're not.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Definitely agree with you that it's not the way that it's done right now. The big tent. I want to talk about the big tent, because you talked about the consensus part, and this is very sort of intimate for me because my grandfather was a journalist during the rise of the United States as a global empire, basically.
Yeah.
In Washington, D.C. And his brother, Joseph Alsop, was a hawk in terms of Vietnam. So he was very much now clearly seen, it's like he made a big mistake in terms of that war. And he kept on going and going and going. And so it's really interesting to, because that was the big tent. And I'm going back and reading these books about both both my grandfather and my great uncle Joe. And both from different perspectives. I found a new one, interestingly, from outside of the consensus, being much more critical of them, which was the first time I got that vision into what was going on. And so in the United States, we had this beautiful special moment of a big tent, and it does seem like the big tent is going away. In the political sphere, already is sort of going away in the mainstream consensus. But the idea of a mainstream consensus, I suspect, is part of the TV. It's like part of the TV thing. I think that the idea of having a mainstream consensus that we can all talk about, like Seinfeld, we all saw the same Seinfeld episode. I don't think that's going to be around anymore. What do you think?
Yeah. It's true. I think whether the TV is the chicken or the egg is, I think, a debate worth considering. But nonetheless, it's definitely a part of that. And one thing so I was rereading a speech by Frederick Douglass recently, and he talks about the Constitution and the government. And he says, the Constitution is like the compass and the American government is the ship. But the ship doesn't always follow the compass.
Yeah.
And I think that, if we're thinking about consensus, I think that so essentially what he's saying is the principles are good, but our ability to follow the principles are flawed. And, MLK said it 100 years later. He called the Declaration of Independence a promissory note that the American government has defaulted on for Black Americans. And so, to me, the consensus should be less about what we do and more about, who we are, which probably needs to be fleshed out even more. But it's who we could be based on this consensus of principles, So what are the principles that we can find consensus in, even if the actions differ?
And this gets back to the decentralization point. In bringing in the early United States with Thomas Jefferson, who I think was strong proponent of decentralization of power, and I might not be remembering this correctly.
No, you're correct.
Yeah, and so there's these forces in this Constitution, in this environment where they're creating the Constitution, some of which believed in a strong executive with a strong centralization, and we've figured out how to create this laboratory of democracy that somehow goes, like, even though the compass and the actions are very all over the place and sometimes lacking, somehow managed to find something beautiful and valuable and like important. And now we're at a stage where I think technology is going to rapidly decentralize power. And I find it so interesting that in the 1960s and 1970s, that was what the New Left created, was this, they accurately looked at what was going on with Vietnam and said that this was a problem of having a centralization, so we need to not trust authority anymore.
Yeah.
But in some ways then created the conditions we're in now because nobody trusts authority. And so now, but we've got technology coming in, and it feels like it's going to rapidly decentralize things. All the people in Silicon Valley are all saying that no, this is going to centralize, and it's all going to be, we're going to be the winners. We're going to be the winners. Yeah. And you guys just like don't worry about it. Just like whatever. And so, but I think they're wrong. I think they do not understand the technology that they're building. And so I think, and mixed with the fact that the TV is sort of changing, the TV is not there anymore to be that sort of consensus builder, the standardization. So I think the United States does still have the institutions left in order to be the best government going into this decentralization period, because of that initial thing. What do you think?
I think that the framework is there, the stuffing is there. I don't know if we'll do it. So there's a few different ways of doing this. So one interesting, we've seen a lot of destabilization of political institutions, and I think where technology is destabilizing things, it's cultural or social institutions, which is, so now it's like trifecta of decentralization, which is a little worrying to me. If we can use the anecdote example of social media, go back into the journals and look at what was being published around social media in 2012, and everyone was celebrating it because it was taking down authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. This is good news that people who never got a voice at particular meetings could now publish their work on social media. So we saw it as this great art of democratization, and very few, if anyone, is saying that now. And so to me, it's crazy how quickly how rapidly our short-term memory loss has developed, that now we're saying, oh, AI is going to change it all. It's going to unify. It's going to democratize. And in my head, I'm like, this literally happened in the last decade and a half. How are we already forgetting and saying that this is the new thing? And so we have some options. We can just throw out the institutions, which I think a lot of people want to do. We can pretend that the institutions still exist and trudge forward. I think this is what kind of the Make America Great Again conservative wing is doing, is we're trying to they're trying to rebrand the institution, but pretend like everything, I think it's a little bit more status quo.
Nostalgia. Nostalgia.
Yeah, I mean, it's by definition nostalgia. The third option is to actually try to rebuild, to acknowledge our failure and flaws and try to rebuild. But that demands humility, and that is lacking right now.
Yep. Oh, man, it's so interesting. And how do you help with humility? There's an education component as well, but there's sort of a gray hairs of wisdom spiritual aspect of it, which to go back to the education part, it's can you evaluate humility? And how do you teach humility? Have you looked into that at all?
Yeah, so that's actually a lot of what we focus on at Thinking Nation. So like, there's 3 historical thinking skills that I can focus on. And 2 of them are identified by these stickers. So we have this sticker here is historical empathy. This one is historical significance. And then the other one that I don't have on my water is contextualization. And so these things demand humility, right? Like, so when I'm presented with a claim, if my first thing to do is to evaluate the claim and not contextualize the claim, I'm already kind of arrogantly approaching it, right? And so if my first questions are questions of contextualization, that is an act of intellectual humility. So one thing I'll just quickly note is I don't know if we can evaluate like sociological or spiritual humility in the classroom, but I think we can evaluate intellectual humility. And then so if I contextualize, and then the next question isn't why is this relevant to me when I'm studying the past, but rather why might this be historically significant to someone in some time or place or some people group. That is another act of humility. That history is not important for what it does for me, but that it might have been important for someone else. And I think those 2 things lead to the third one, which is historical empathy. And so once again, it's not an emotional empathy. I can say out loud that Thomas Jefferson's enslavement of humans was evil. But historical empathy, this understanding, allows me to also say his writing of the Declaration of Independence is pretty freaking great in the like span of human history. And so historical empathy means I have the ability to understand and sit with tension. And that also demands humility, right? It's like, well, like who am I to judge? Like I wasn't a wealthy white landowner in Virginia in the 1700s. So why can I just so quickly say that I wouldn't have fallen to the same sins as some of these other people? And, you know, if you're listening, I am a white male. And so, like, you know, I think but those steps of intellectual humility through those historical thinking skills that we can assess in a classroom, we can assess those historical thinking skills, give students practice in not putting themselves first. Right? History is no longer an opportunity to pad our own narcissism, but it's an opportunity to explore perspectives that we don't initially understand or even agree with.
Okay, so I would like to spend a little bit more time talking about the book because we've now gotten very far away from.
Yeah, of course.
So what do you suggest in terms of what do questions do for us? Let's ground it in the conversation. What do questions do at this critical period where we're moving into this like strange place where nobody's ever been? It feels like we're sort of exploring space, and maybe that is where all this is headed. But what do questions do for us in terms of building institutions, and how can I write a book about questions, given every time I ask a question, it just leads to like 10 different more questions. And how do you like put it all into something real and a book? Have you written a book before? Like what, like, yeah.
No. So one thing I keep thinking about as we're talking is that asking a question is an act of humility. Right? Because by definition, you're acknowledging that you don't know an answer, that you don't know something. And so I also will say in the business sector that I see, asking a question is a sign of weakness. And so that needs to be, that paradigm needs to shift, right? If we can't acknowledge that in questions there are strength, and there is humility, then we can't rebuild. Yeah, so that's stage one, that acknowledgement. And then, but there is a sense of like, I was talking to someone recently that good historians are confident but not arrogant. And so I think that like at some point we can't let the questions spin into other questions. We have to make a statement, right? And like, you know, I haven't written a book, but I've written like, you know, long enough historical articles that it's like I can read one more, you know, autobiography or narrative primary source. I can read one more historian's perspective, but at some point I need to start writing. And so that's where it's like, it's that confidence without arrogance. Like I have enough to work with right now. I'm not going to arrogantly use absolute language in my writing. I'll use conditional language like might or maybe, but nonetheless, I'm going to start writing. And so I think that balance, like asking questions is an act of humility, but it's okay to start writing. It's okay to have some confidence. Like I think we just need to be more honest about that process and say it out loud. Don't try to like sweep it under a rug. And if we can do that, I think that the structures are there to build stronger institutions.
It's a great point. It's so interesting because I got the idea to start writing a book about a month ago, and then got the outline. I know what I want to write about, and I've not been able to write. And it's so interesting because I did this like a year and a half ago with coding, after 10 years of trying to learn how to code and hating every minute of it, and then AI coming around, and all of a sudden I was able to do this thing that I'd never been able to do before. And so it built a lot of confidence. And then the writing, it's so interesting, the writing process. And now I understand a little bit more about why writers are so tortured as individuals. It's because there's something really interesting there, because if you're writing, you got to be writing something, I mean, that nobody's ever written before. I mean,
you have to add something to the conversation.
Yeah, you got to add something. Yeah, it's interesting. That's like a highly emotional process.
Yeah.
And it is a super interesting. The other component of that is the fact that with LLMs and AI and our attention span, you know, what percentage of people are still going to be reading books in 10 years is a question that I am not at all sure on the answer on that one. I know that I still love reading books, but it's so like, what is a book? And so you mentioned longer articles, and I was thinking about, because in the past couple weeks I've been thinking maybe instead of writing one book, I should write a few long form articles, a few a little bit long. Like now I'm used to just tweeting things.
Yeah.
And that's like, I think it's good to be able to do short, very, very short form. But now I want to graduate to the next level of writing.
Sure.
And so something about writing like a medium, I need to just start with a process to start writing a medium form writing, I would say.
Yeah, I gave myself the goal so we're coming up on the end of our fiscal year right now at Thinking Nation, and I gave myself a goal to publish an op-ed every quarter for that kind of reason. And so I'm barely making it. Today's June 26th, and I'll have one coming out June 27th, so I barely made it for this quarter. But nonetheless, that kind of goal allowed me to process longer, but not like, you know, months long thoughts. So they're all around. How long
is an op-ed?
Around 1,000 words.
Okay. So yeah, I think the 1,000-word mark probably makes the most sense. Cool.
And
well, thank you so much for talking with me. How can our listeners find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, I would love for them to, you know, check us out on our website, thinkingnation.org. Thinking_nation tends to be our handle on every social media. And yeah, keep up with what we're doing. We love to work at the intersection of history and civics, you know, good history education as an exercise in civics. And I always will continue to be thinking about questions. So I appreciate being able to do that today with you.
Thank you so much.